A racist cop beats a black woman with his baton, completely unaware that she's the new chief of police. What happens next will leave you questioning everything about power, prejudice, and accountability. How would you feel if someone judged you unfairly, not knowing who you truly are? Or have you ever witnessed such an injustice and wondered what you'd do? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The fluorescent lights flickered dimly above the worn tiles of East Bridge Police Department, casting uneven shadows that seemed to deepen the tension in the air. Conversations were terse, clipped. The occasional sharp bark of a sergeant cut through the low hum of activity, commanding attention. Officers moved with practiced indifference, some shuffling papers, others leaning against walls in casual defiance of authority. This was no welcoming sanctuary of justice. It was a battlefield, and everyone knew their place in the pecking order. Samantha Sam Carter stepped through the glass doors, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She was dressed in a neatly pressed blazer, her hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. The atmosphere hit her like a wall of heat. The glances, the raised eyebrows, the immediate judgment. She'd felt it before, in courtrooms, at the academy, in every room where her presence was an anomaly. But here, it was visceral, a nearly tangible barrier of disdain. The lobby stilled as she crossed it. Conversations tapered off, replaced by murmurs and not-so-subtle whispers. "Who's that?" one officer muttered under his breath. "New brass," another replied, with a smirk that carried a lifetime of doubt in its tone. Sam kept walking, her eyes forward, posture steady. She wasn't here to play nice or seek approval. She had a job to do, and she intended to do it. "Hold it right there," a voice barked, cutting through the low hum. She turned to face the source. A tall, broad-shouldered officer with a shaved head and a cocky grin strode toward her, a baton in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. His badge gleamed under the flickering lights. Officer Jake Daniels. He stopped a few feet away, his expression radiating authority laced with hostility. "You lost?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of casual condescension reserved for someone looking to assert dominance. "No," Sam replied evenly. "I'm here for work." Daniels chuckled, shaking his head. "Work? What are you, HR or maybe legal? Because you sure don't look like someone who belongs out here." The remark earned a chuckle from a couple of officers nearby. Sam felt the heat of their stares, but refused to react. "I'm Lieutenant Carter," she said, her voice firm, unshaken. "And I'm here to see Captain Ramirez." The laughter stopped abruptly. Daniel's smirk didn't falter, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Lieutenant, huh?" he said, tapping his baton against his palm. "Funny. You don't look the part." Sam didn't blink. "And you don't look like someone who knows how to follow protocol. Yet here we are." The room went silent. Daniel's smirk vanished, replaced by a hardened glare. He took a step closer, invading her space. "You've got a lot of nerve walking in here like you own the place," he hissed. "Let me give you some advice. Around here, respect isn't given. It's earned." Sam met his gaze unflinching. "Then you'd better start earning mine." A tense silence filled the room. Daniel's grip on his baton tightened, and for a moment, it looked as though he might do something reckless. He raised the baton slightly, a subtle but deliberate move meant to intimidate. But in his eagerness to project power, he misjudged his grip, and the baton slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor with an awkward echo. A few of the onlookers snickered quietly. Daniel's face flushed, and his jaw tightened as he bent down to retrieve it. Sam didn't move, her expression neutral, but her eyes held his like a challenge. "Lieutenant Carter." A calm but firm voice broke the standoff. Both Sam and Daniels turned to see Captain Ramirez standing in the doorway to his office, his arms crossed over his chest. His sharp gaze flickered between the two of them before settling on Daniels. "That's enough," Ramirez said, his tone brooking no argument. Daniels stepped back reluctantly, the baton now clenched tightly in his hand. "Just making sure the lieutenant understands how things work around here," he muttered. "She understands just fine," Ramirez replied, his voice carrying an edge of warning. "Now get back to work." Daniels glared at Sam one last time before turning and walking away, his boots thudding against the tile. The room slowly resumed its activity, though the tension lingered. Ramirez gestured for Sam to follow him. "My office," he said curtly, disappearing back into the hallway. As Sam walked behind him, she could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her. She didn't let it show, but her heart was pounding. This wasn't just a new assignment. It was a proving ground, and the first battle had already begun. Samantha Carter knew what it meant to fight for a seat at the table. Growing up in a modest neighborhood with few opportunities, she'd learned early that nothing would be handed to her. Scholarships, late nights with textbooks, and relentless determination had taken her through law school and the police academy. She'd thrived in spaces where her presence was questioned, where whispers of, "she doesn't belong here," were a constant hum in the background. But here, at Eastbridge Police Department, the whispers weren't subtle. They were loud, pointed, and sometimes direct. "Quota hire." Sam turned sharply at the words, her jaw tightening. Jake Daniels leaned against a desk across the room, his arms crossed. His smirk was all confidence, laced with disdain. Harris, the younger officer standing next to him, chuckled. Sam squared her shoulders, walking past without a word, but the comment hung in the air like a bad smell. The remark wasn't new, but it stung just the same. As she reached her desk, Harris's voice carried across the room, loud enough for her to hear. "Guess we're hiring anyone these days." Sam froze, her fingers tightening around the case file she was holding. Slowly, she turned. "Do you have something to say to me, Officer Harris?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Harris shrugged, feigning innocence. "Just making an observation, ma'am." Daniels snorted, and Sam's gaze shifted to him. "It's funny," she said evenly. "You spend so much time observing me, I'm starting to think you don't have enough real work to do." The smirk slipped from Daniels' face, replaced by a hard glare. Harris looked taken aback, glancing at Daniels for support, but Sam didn't wait for a response. She turned back to her desk, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor, a sharp punctuation to the encounter. Later that day, Sam headed to her car in the precinct parking lot, her mind racing with everything she'd seen and heard since she'd arrived. The hostility was more than just passive resistance. It was deliberate. "Lieutenant Carter," she stopped mid-step, turning to see Harris leaning against a patrol car, his expression somewhere between smug and confrontational. "Got a minute?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Sam crossed her arms. "What do you want, Harris?" He pushed off the car, closing the distance between them with a lazy stride. "Just curious. What's it like getting handed everything on a silver platter? Must be nice not having to work for it." Her jaw tightened. "You think I haven't worked for this?" "I think," Harris said, stepping closer, "you're here because someone upstairs wanted to check a box. Diversity, right? Gotta make the department look good." Sam didn't flinch. "And you think that says more about me than it does about this department?" Harris hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her question. But before he could respond, Sam stepped closer, her voice lowering. "I've worked twice as hard as anyone here to get to where I am," she said. "So if you've got a problem with that, maybe you should ask yourself why you're so threatened by me." Harris opened his mouth to reply, but Daniels' voice cut through the air before he could. "Harris," Daniels called from across the lot. "You coming, or what?" Harris glanced between Daniels and Sam, then stepped back with a shrug. "See you around, Lieutenant." Sam watched him walk away, her pulse pounding. The tension was palpable, and she knew it wasn't going to ease anytime soon. The hostility didn't end in the parking lot. By the next morning, it had escalated into whispers in hallways, lingering stares, and deliberate roadblocks. Files she needed were suddenly missing. Emails went unanswered, and every interaction with Daniels or Harris was charged with veiled insults and outright challenges. As Sam made her way to the evidence room, she caught sight of Daniels and Harris talking in low voices near the break room. They both fell silent when they saw her, their expressions unreadable but pointed. "Morning," Sam said coolly, not stopping as she passed them. "Lieutenant," Daniels replied, his tone dripping with mock politeness. Sam's grip on her clipboard tightened, but she didn't stop. Inside the evidence room, she rifled through a stack of case files, her focus sharper than ever. If they thought they could rattle her, they were wrong. She had faced worse than their juvenile antics before, but the undercurrent of something darker, something systemic, was beginning to gnaw at her. As she pulled a file from the stack, the door creaked open behind her. She turned to see Ramirez, his expression grim. "Got a minute?" he asked. Sam nodded, following him back to his office. Once inside, Ramirez shut the door and leaned against his desk, crossing his arms. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said without preamble. Sam raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm doing my job?" "Because you're new," Ramirez corrected. "And because the people here don't like change. You walk in, start asking questions, pushing boundaries, they're going to push back." Sam didn't look away. "And you're telling me to back off?" "No," Ramirez said after a pause. "I'm telling you to be smart. You're not going to win them over by going head-to-head with Daniels or Harris. They've been here for years. They have alliances. You don't." Sam folded her arms. "Then I'll just have to make my own." Ramirez studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Just be careful," he said finally. "This place has a way of chewing people up." Sam left Ramirez's office with his warning ringing in her ears. But she wasn't deterred. The hostility wasn't just about her being new. It was about something deeper, a culture of complacency and corruption she was determined to expose, no matter the cost. The day had started tense, and by the time noon rolled around, it had escalated into open hostility. Sam was reviewing case files in the precinct's common area when Daniels sauntered in, his posture casual, but his eyes fixed on her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, his voice laced with false politeness. "Hard at work, I see." Sam didn't look up. "What do you need, Daniels?" "Need? Nothing." He leaned against a nearby desk, his baton tapping idly against the surface. "Just curious how you're finding things around here. Adjusting well?" She glanced at him, her tone sharp. "I don't recall asking for your concern." He grinned, unfazed. "Not concern. Just making sure you're comfortable. Don't want anyone to feel out of place." Sam closed the file in front of her, standing to meet his gaze. "Cut to the point, Daniels." The grin faded, replaced by a hard, calculating look. "The point, Carter, is that this isn't the kind of place where you can waltz in and start making demands. Respect is earned. And so far, all you've done is make enemies." Sam stepped closer, her voice steady. "Respect doesn't come from intimidation or threats. And if you think I'm going to back down because you and your buddies don't like me being here, you're in for a surprise." The tension in the room was palpable. Several officers nearby had stopped what they were doing to watch, their expressions ranging from amused to uneasy. Daniels straightened, his hand tightening on his baton. "Careful, Carter. You're walking a fine line." Sam's eyes dropped to the baton for a split second, then back to his face. "Is that a threat, Officer Daniels?" He didn't answer, but the way he stepped closer, invading her space, spoke volumes. Before Sam could respond, Daniels reached out, his hand gripping her arm. The action was deliberate, a power play meant to assert dominance. The room went silent. Sam didn't pull away immediately. Instead, she locked eyes with him, her voice cold and cutting. "Take your hand off me, now." For a moment, Daniels didn't move, his grip tightening slightly as if testing her resolve. Then, as if realizing the attention they'd drawn, he let go abruptly. "Watch yourself," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You don't want to make me your enemy." Sam stepped back, raising her voice just enough to carry across the room. "Touch me again, Daniels, and I'll make sure the only thing you're holding is a termination notice." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some turned away quickly, pretending to busy themselves, while others exchanged amused glances. No one stepped in. No one said a word. Daniels's jaw tightened, his composure slipping for just a moment before he forced a smirk back onto his face. "Big words, Lieutenant. Let's see if you can back them up." With that, he turned and strode out of the room, his footsteps heavy against the tile. The incident didn't end there. By the afternoon, the whispers had spread through the precinct like wildfire. Sam could feel the weight of every glance, hear the faint murmurs as she walked by. The divide was clear. Daniels had the loyalty of many in the department, and they weren't subtle about their support. At one point, Harris approached her near the coffee station, a sly grin on his face. "You really know how to make an impression," he said, his tone mocking. Sam didn't look at him as she poured her coffee. "Something you want to say, Harris?" He chuckled. "Just wondering how long you think you'll last." "Daniels isn't the kind of guy you want to cross." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Daniels isn't my concern, but anyone who enables him will be." Harris's grin faltered, but he recovered quickly, shrugging as he walked away. "Good luck with that, Lieutenant." By the end of the day, Sam found herself called into Ramirez's office. He was sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable as she entered. "Close the door," he said. Sam did as he asked, standing at attention as he gestured for her to sit. "I've been hearing things," Ramirez began, his tone carefully neutral, "about what happened in the common area." Sam didn't flinch. "Daniels put his hands on me. I warned him not to." Ramirez sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Carter, you've been here less than a week, and already you're stirring up trouble." "With respect, Captain, I didn't stir up anything." "Daniels did." Ramirez's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you don't think you could have handled it differently? Maybe de-escalated instead of escalating?" Sam met his gaze evenly. "I won't tolerate being manhandled by anyone, Captain, especially not in front of the entire precinct." For a moment, Ramirez said nothing, his fingers steepled as he studied her. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "Daniels has been here a long time. He's got a lot of people in his corner. You need to pick your battles carefully." "Understood," Sam said, though her tone carried a note of defiance. Ramirez shook his head. "Just be careful, Carter. You're not going to win any popularity contests here." As Sam left Ramirez's office, she knew the captain's warning was well-intentioned, but misplaced. She wasn't fighting for popularity. She was fighting for something bigger, a system that seemed determined to protect itself at all costs. Samantha stepped into Ramirez's office, closing the door firmly behind her. The captain was already seated, his fingers laced together on the desk, his expression unreadable. A stack of reports lay in front of him, untouched. "Sit down," he said without looking up. Sam complied, folding her hands in her lap, waiting for him to speak. The silence stretched until Ramirez finally leaned back in his chair and met her gaze. "We need to talk about Daniels," he said, his voice heavy. "I assumed as much," Sam replied, her tone neutral but firm. Ramirez exhaled, leaning forward and bracing his elbows on the desk. "Carter, you've only been here a few days, and you've already managed to stir up enough tension to last a year. Do you have any idea what kind of damage this could cause?" Sam's jaw tightened. "With respect, Captain, Daniels caused the damage. I'm just holding him accountable." Ramirez shook his head. "That's not how this works. Daniels has been here for years. He knows the system, knows how to get things done. This precinct doesn't run smoothly without people like him." Sam leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through his defense. "So that justifies his behavior? That's your reasoning for turning a blind eye to what he's doing?" "It's not about turning a blind eye," Ramirez said, his tone sharpening. "It's about survival. This isn't some courtroom or academy classroom. Out here, we rely on each other. The streets don't care about fairness or ethics. They care about results." Sam's eyes narrowed. "And you think Daniels is getting results? Or is he just making sure no one looks too closely at what he's really doing?" Ramirez stiffened, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," Sam shot back. "I've seen the reports he signed off on. Arrests without cause. Evidence that conveniently goes missing. Complaints that disappear before they're investigated. And now, he's physically intimidating his colleagues. That's not just unethical, it's criminal." Ramirez's jaw worked as he absorbed her words. For a moment, it looked like he might argue, but instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "You think you're the first person to come in here and try to clean up the mess?" he said quietly. Sam didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. "I've been in this job long enough to see how these things play out," Ramirez said, his tone low but firm. "Someone comes in with big ideas about changing the system, about rooting out corruption. They make enemies fast. And then, when the dust settles, nothing changes, except that person isn't here anymore." Sam straightened in her chair. "And you're okay with that? With letting people like Daniels run this place into the ground because it's easier than standing up to them?" Ramirez's eyes snapped back to hers, sharp and filled with something between frustration and regret. "Don't you dare assume I'm okay with it. You think I haven't tried? I've gone up against people like Daniels before, and all it's ever done is make things worse." "Maybe that's because no one's followed through," Sam countered. "Maybe what this place needs is someone who won't back down the moment it gets hard." Ramirez's expression softened, but only slightly. "You think you're that person?" "Yes," Sam said without hesitation. For a moment, Ramirez said nothing. Then he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot below. His shoulders were tense, his hands clasped behind his back. "There was a case a few years ago," he began, his voice quieter now. "An officer under my command, good on paper, but there were signs, complaints from civilians, minor discrepancies in reports. I ignored them, thought they weren't worth the trouble. And then one day, he crossed a line, and someone got hurt." Sam watched him carefully, sensing the weight of the memory. "I reported him," Ramirez continued. "But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. The department backed him because it was easier than admitting fault, and I was left to pick up the pieces. I told myself I did everything I could, but the truth is, I didn't. I stayed quiet when it mattered most." He turned back to face her, his expression hard but conflicted. "I don't want that to happen again." "But Carter, this place doesn't change overnight. You're playing with fire, and if you're not careful, you're going to get burned." Sam stood, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "I'd rather get burned than let this continue. Daniels isn't just a problem. He's a symptom of something bigger. And if we don't deal with him, it's only going to get worse." Ramirez sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts won't protect you when Daniels decides to push back. He's not the kind of guy who takes challenges lightly." "Then I'll be ready," Sam said simply. Ramirez studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just remember, this place has a way of chewing people up. Don't let it take you down with it." As Sam left Ramirez's office, her resolve only hardened. His warning didn't deter her. It reinforced her belief that change was necessary, no matter the cost. If she had to stand alone to expose Daniels and the system that enabled him, so be it. Samantha Carter sat in the precinct's records room, surrounded by stacks of case files. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as she flipped through another report, her eyes scanning line after line of arrests authorized by Officer Jake Daniels. Patterns began to emerge. Patterns that didn't sit right. One report detailed an arrest based on suspicious activity, yet the witness statement was missing. Another claimed possession of illegal substances, but no evidence had been logged. And then there were the suspects. A disproportionate number of them were young, black men, arrested under vague charges that conveniently led nowhere in court. Sam grabbed a fresh stack of files, her focus narrowing. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Daniels wasn't just bending the rules, he was erasing them. Hours later, Harris walked into the records room, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something more subdued. He hesitated at the door before stepping inside, his gaze darting to the files spread across the table. "Busy day?" he asked, his voice almost casual. Sam didn't look up. "What do you want, Harris?" He stepped closer, glancing at the files. "Word is you're digging into Daniels." "And?" Sam finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. Harris sighed, pulling a chair over and sitting down across from her. "And I might have something you'll want to see." Sam arched an eyebrow. Why the sudden change of heart? He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Let's just say I've seen enough to know he's not as untouchable as he thinks he is. And if he goes down, I'm not going with him." Sam studied him for a moment before gesturing for him to continue. Harris reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, sliding it across the table. "This has copies of reports Daniels thought he buried. Arrest records, witness statements, and a few complaints that never made it past the desk sergeant." Sam picked up the drive, her eyes narrowing. "Why do you have this?" "Because I don't trust him either," Harris admitted. "I've been watching him for a while. He's been sloppy lately, too cocky." It was only a matter of time before someone noticed. She inserted the drive into her laptop, scrolling through the files. As she read, her stomach tightened. The evidence was damning. Cases closed without explanation, suspects coerced into confessions, and financial discrepancies that hinted at bribes. "This is solid," Sam said, her voice low. "Why haven't you taken it to Ramirez?" Harris smirked bitterly. "Because Ramirez won't do anything unless he has to. And let's be real, you're the only one crazy enough to actually go after Daniels." Sam met his gaze, her expression firm. "If you're playing both sides, Harris, this ends badly for you." "I'm not," he said quickly. "But you need to know something else." She closed the laptop, leaning forward. "What?" Harris glanced around as if making sure they were alone. "Daniels isn't acting alone. He's got people covering for him. Guys in the precinct who look the other way or help him when things get messy." Sam's stomach sank. "Names?" Harris hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't have proof. But I know for a fact that some of the senior officers have his back. They're tied up in the same crap he is. Bribes, falsified evidence, all of it. If you go after Daniels, you're going to stir up a hornet's nest." Sam's jaw tightened. "Good. It's about time someone did." The next morning, Sam arrived early, armed with the information Harris had given her. She compiled a list of questionable arrests and cross-referenced them with the precinct's internal records. The connections were unmistakable. Daniels' misconduct was part of a larger web, and several officers' names kept appearing in his files. At one point, Ramirez stopped by her desk, his brow furrowed as he glanced at the growing stack of papers. "You've been busy?" he said. Sam didn't look up. "I'm just doing my job." His gaze lingered on her before he spoke again. "Be careful, Carter. You're poking at things that don't like being poked." "I know," she said simply. Ramirez shook his head and walked away, leaving her alone with her work. By mid-afternoon, Sam confronted Harris again, this time in a quieter corner of the precinct. "I need more," she said bluntly. Harris raised an eyebrow. "More what?" "Proof," she said. "You said Daniels has people covering for him. I need something solid to connect them." Harris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No," Sam said firmly. After a long pause, Harris nodded. "There's a locker in the basement. Daniels keeps things there. Stuff he doesn't want on record. I don't know what's in it, but if there's dirt on anyone, it'll be there. Sam's eyes narrowed. How do you know this? I've seen him use it, Harris admitted. But you didn't hear that from me. That evening, Sam made her way to the basement, her heart pounding as she approached the rows of lockers. Harris had given her the number, but the lock itself was a problem. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone, before using a set of bolt cutters she'd brought with her. The lock snapped, and the door creaked open. Inside, she found folders stuffed with papers, a few unmarked envelopes, and a flash drive. She didn't stop to examine them there. She stuffed everything into her bag and left as quickly as she could. Back in her apartment, Sam laid the contents out on her table. The folders contained more falsified reports, but the envelopes were what caught her attention. They were filled with cash, clearly payouts from someone who wanted Daniels' cooperation. The flash drive was the final piece. It contained emails, texts, and even audio recordings of Daniels coordinating with other officers to cover up evidence, intimidate witnesses, and take bribes. Sam leaned back in her chair, the weight of what she'd uncovered settling over her. This wasn't just about Daniels anymore. This was systemic. Armed with undeniable proof, Sam realized she wasn't just dealing with one corrupt officer. She was up against an entire network, and if she wanted to take them down, she'd have to tread carefully while preparing for the inevitable fallout. It started as a quiet buzz. Early that morning, Sam noticed a few officers gathered around a desk, their hushed voices laced with urgency. She paid little attention at first, focused on reviewing more files connected to Daniels. But as more heads turned toward her and the murmurs grew louder, she realized something was wrong. "Lieutenant Carter," a voice called out. It was Harris, his expression unreadable as he gestured her toward a nearby monitor. "What is it?" she asked, her tone clipped. He hesitated, then clicked play on the screen. A video began to play, shaky but unmistakable. It was the confrontation between her and Daniels in the common area. The moment he'd grabbed her arm, the venom in his words captured clearly. "You're about to learn how things work around here," his voice growled in the recording. The video cut abruptly, but the damage was already done. Sam's stomach tightened. "Where did this come from?" Harris shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "It's all over social media. Someone leaked the security footage." Within hours, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked it up, splicing it into reports that highlighted the culture of intimidation and corruption within the Eastbridge Police Department. Journalists camped outside the precinct, their cameras and microphones ready to capture any statement they could. Inside, the atmosphere was toxic. Some officers avoided Sam entirely, their eyes darting away when she entered a room. Others stared her down, their hostility palpable. Daniels was nowhere to be seen, but his influence lingered. Sam found Ramirez in his office, pacing behind his desk as he spoke into the phone. When he hung up, he turned to her, his face drawn and tense. "This is a disaster," he said without preamble. "Why?" Sam asked, crossing her arms. "Because people are finally seeing the truth?" Ramirez shook his head, his frustration evident. "Because this precinct is under a microscope now. Do you have any idea what kind of scrutiny we're about to face? IA, the media, the mayor's office, they're all coming for us." "Good," Sam replied. "They should." He slammed his hand on the desk, his patience snapping. "This isn't about justice anymore, Carter. This is a political firestorm, and you've thrown gasoline on it." Sam held her ground. "I didn't leak the video, Captain, but I'm not going to apologize for what it shows. Daniels crossed the line, and now everyone knows it." Ramirez let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "And what happens when the rest of the department decides you're the enemy? Daniels is already rallying his supporters. They're saying you're trying to bring this whole place down. Maybe it needs to come down," Sam shot back. "Because this isn't just about Daniels. It's about everyone who's enabled him." For a moment, Ramirez didn't respond. Then he sank into his chair, his expression heavy with resignation. "You don't understand what you're up against, Carter. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that protects itself at all costs." "Then it's time to change the system," Sam said firmly. Outside the precinct, the crowd of reporters grew thicker by the hour. When Sam finally stepped outside, microphones were thrust toward her, the barrage of questions relentless. "Lieutenant Carter, Can you comment on the video? Is Officer Daniels being suspended? Is this part of a larger investigation into corruption? She raised her hand to silence them. I can't comment on an ongoing investigation, she said, her voice steady. But I will say this. No one is above the law, not even those who wear the badge. Her words only fueled the media frenzy. By the time she returned inside, Ramirez was waiting for her in the hallway, his expression grim. You're making things worse, he said. No, Sam replied. I'm making them better. It just doesn't feel that way yet. That evening, Sam found herself reviewing the evidence she'd collected in her apartment. The files Harris had given her, the reports from the locker in the basement, and now the fallout from the video. All of it painted a picture of a department steeped in corruption and complacency. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was a text from an unknown number. You don't know what you're messing with. Back off. Sam stared at the message, her mind racing. It could have been from Daniels or one of his supporters, but it didn't matter. She wasn't backing down. The next morning, the tension inside the precinct was suffocating. Officers clustered in small groups, their conversations halting whenever Sam walked by. Daniels finally reappeared, his expression dark as he made his way to Ramirez's office. Sam watched him go, her jaw tightening. Harris approached her cautiously. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, he said quietly. Good, Sam replied. Maybe it's time the nest got destroyed. Harris hesitated, then leaned in closer. Be careful. Daniels isn't just angry. He's scared. And scared people do stupid things. I can handle Daniels, Sam said. Harris shook his head. It's not just him. There are people here who'll protect him no matter what. You need to watch your back. The warning came too late. By midday, Daniels had begun openly challenging her, rallying other officers to his side. In the break room, she overheard him speaking to a small group. She thinks she can come in here and tear everything apart. We're not letting that happen. Sam stepped into the room, cutting through the tension with her presence. If you have something to say, Daniels, say it to me. He turned, his expression cold. Oh, I think I've said enough. Good, Sam replied. Because the evidence will speak for itself. Daniels smirked. You think a few files and a leaked video are enough to take me down? You're more naive than I thought. Sam stepped closer, her voice low and steady. You've underestimated me, Daniels. That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking no one would notice what you've been doing. But they've noticed now, and it's only a matter of time before you're held accountable. The room went silent as Daniels stared her down, but Sam didn't waver. By the following morning, the tension in the precinct had transformed into something more calculated. Officers clustered together in hushed conversations that stopped the moment Sam entered the room. Daniels, however, no longer tried to hide his defiance. He'd rallied a group of supporters, officers who either owed him favors or shared his disdain for Sam's presence. Their strategy became clear quickly. Undermine her every move, obscure evidence, and make her job impossible. Sam reached for a file at the records desk, but the officer behind the counter gave her a cold look. Sorry, Lieutenant. That one's not available right now. Her voice was sharp. It's an open case. Hand it over. The officer hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Sam didn't need to turn around to know who was watching. It's okay, Daniels said from across the room, his voice dripping with mockery. Give the lieutenant whatever she wants. We wouldn't want her thinking we're uncooperative. The officer reluctantly handed over the file. Sam took it without a word, her jaw tight as she walked away. That evening, as Sam reviewed documents in her apartment, her phone buzzed. The number was unknown, but she answered anyway. You really don't know when to stop, do you? Daniel's voice came through the line, calm but laced with menace. Sam didn't flinch. If you're calling to scare me, you're wasting your time. You think this is a game? He asked, his tone hardening. You're digging in places you don't belong, Carter. People are starting to notice, and not in a good way. Sam leaned back in her chair, her voice steady. What's the matter, Daniels, Afraid I'm getting too close to the truth? There was a pause, then a low chuckle. You don't understand what you're messing with. This isn't just about me. There are people who'll do whatever it takes to protect what we've built. Keep pushing, and you'll find out just how far we're willing to go. The line went dead. Sam stared at her phone, her pulse steady despite the weight of the threat. Daniels wasn't bluffing, but neither was she. The next morning, Sam arrived early, determined to stay ahead of Daniels' games. She'd barely stepped through the doors when Harris intercepted her, his face pale. "Carter," he said quickly, pulling her aside. "You need to know what's happening." "What now?" she asked, her tone clipped. Harris glanced around, lowering his voice. "Daniels has been meeting with some of the other guys after hours. He's trying to cover his tracks, shredding files, rewriting reports, whatever he can to make sure nothing sticks." Sam's jaw tightened. "And you're just now telling me this?" Harris raised his hands defensively. "I'm telling you because I don't want to get dragged down with him. He's planning something big, Carter. You need to be ready." That evening, Sam stayed late at the precinct, combing through the files she'd managed to secure before Daniels could get his hands on them. She was making progress, connecting dots and building a clearer picture of his corruption. But the longer she worked, the more she realized she needed hard evidence, something undeniable that tied Daniels and his group directly to their crimes. As she locked her office for the night, her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "You really don't learn, do you?" Daniels' voice was colder this time, lacking the smugness she was used to. "I warned you, Carter, but you're too damn stubborn to listen." "Is this the part where you threaten me again?" Sam asked, her voice calm. "No," he said flatly. "This is the part where I remind you that accidents happen. Bad things happen to people who don't know when to quit." Sam's grip on the phone tightened. "And this is the part where I remind you that I don't scare easily." There was a pause, then a low laugh. "You're going to regret this." The line went dead. Sam didn't go home that night. Instead, she called Ramirez, requesting an emergency meeting. When she arrived at his office, he was waiting, his expression grim. "This better be good," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Sam remained standing, her voice firm. "Daniels is organizing a resistance. He's destroying evidence, rewriting reports, and threatening me directly." Ramirez sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is getting out of control." "It's already out of control," Sam snapped. "He's not just covering his tracks. He's trying to intimidate anyone who stands in his way. If we don't act now, he's going to bury everything." Ramirez stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "What do you need?" "I need access to every record Daniels has touched in the past 6 months, Sam said. "Emails, call logs, surveillance footage, everything. And I need to know who he's been meeting with after hours." Ramirez hesitated, then picked up the phone. "You'll have it by morning." Daniels's defiance had reached its peak, and the battle lines were drawn. But as Sam prepared to take the next step, she knew the fight was far from over. The closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became, and she was ready to play. The old warehouse loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching under the faint glow of streetlights. Sam parked her car a block away, her heartbeat steady despite the tension coursing through her veins. Ramirez and Harris pulled up moments later, stepping out with cautious precision. "This is where he's holed up?" Ramirez asked, scanning the area. Sam nodded. "According to the intel, he's been using this place to stash files and meet his allies. If we're going to catch him, it's here." "Let's move," Ramirez said, his voice low. The three approached the building, their steps silent against the cracked pavement. Harris tested the side door, and it creaked open with a foreboding groan. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and mildew. The faint hum of machinery buzzed somewhere in the distance, masking any subtle sounds. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Ramirez held up a hand, signaling them to stop. A faint scuffle echoed from the far corner, followed by a low mutter. "He's here," Harris whispered. Sam motioned for them to spread out, her hand resting on her sidearm. She approached the source of the noise, her footsteps light but deliberate. "Carter," a voice called from the shadows, stopping her in her tracks. Daniels stepped out, his silhouette sharp against the dim light filtering through broken windows. His smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "Took you long enough," he said. "Drop the act, Daniels," Sam replied, her voice steady. "It's over." "Over?" Daniels let out a low chuckle. "You think walking in here with a badge and a gun changes anything? You're out of your depth." Sam didn't flinch. "We have everything we need. Your files, your emails, the evidence you've tried so hard to bury. It's all coming out. Daniels tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. And what makes you think anyone's going to care? This place doesn't run on your sense of justice, Carter. It runs on loyalty. You think you've won, but you don't understand how this game works. Behind her, Sam heard a faint rustle. She turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of movement in the shadows. Harris was circling around, his weapon drawn, while Ramirez held position near the entrance. I understand plenty, Sam said, keeping her focus on Daniels. You've spent years building your empire on fear and intimidation, but it's falling apart, and you know it. Daniels took a step closer, his hands at his sides, but tense, ready. You think you're better than me? That you're some kind of savior? You're just a pawn, Carter. They'll chew you up and spit you out like the rest of us. Maybe, Sam said. But at least I won't go down as a coward who hid behind corruption to protect his own skin. Daniel's jaw tightened. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension stretching like a wire about to snap. Then it happened. Daniels lunged, his hand reaching for the knife she hadn't seen hidden at his side. Sam reacted instantly, stepping back and drawing her weapon. Freeze! She shouted, her voice echoing through the warehouse. Daniels didn't stop. He moved with a desperate energy, the knife slashing through the air as Sam sidestepped. A shot rang out. Ramirez fired into the air, the sharp crack reverberating off the walls. Drop it, Daniels, he barked. Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting between Sam and Ramirez. For a moment, it looked like he might surrender. But then he turned, bolting toward the far exit. Harris intercepted him, tackling him to the ground. The knife clattered away as the two struggled. Daniels threw a punch, but Harris blocked it, pinning him down with a grunt. Enough! Ramirez shouted, rushing over to help. Together, they hauled Daniels to his feet, securing him with handcuffs. Breathing heavily, Daniels glared at Sam as Ramirez read him his rights. You think this changes anything? He spat. You haven't won. You don't even know what you're up against. Sam stepped closer, her expression cold. I know enough. And this is just the beginning. Daniels smirked, even as Ramirez shoved him toward the exit. We'll see, Carter. We'll see. Outside, the cool night air hit them like a wave. Harris leaned against the patrol car, catching his breath, while Ramirez called for backup. Sam watched as Daniels was loaded into the back of the cruiser, his defiance still etched on his face. Ramirez approached her, his expression unreadable. We got him. For now, Sam said, her tone somber. But he's right. This isn't over. Ramirez nodded slowly. No, it's not. Daniels was in custody. But his cryptic warnings lingered in Sam's mind. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became that the corruption extended far beyond one man. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. Daniels' arrest set off a chain reaction that rippled through the precinct. By the next morning, Internal Affairs descended on Eastbridge, their presence unmistakable as they combed through files, questioned officers, and dismantled the facade of normalcy. The station, usually humming with quiet efficiency, was now tense and fractured. Sam sat in Ramirez's office, a stack of documents in front of her. Across the desk, the captain looked grim, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls from the mayor's office, reporters, and other precincts. They're digging into everything, Ramirez said, his tone low. Complaints, case files, personnel records. This isn't just about Daniels anymore. It never was, Sam replied, her voice calm. Ramirez shook his head. You realize what you've started, don't you? They're talking about a full departmental audit. Officers are going to be suspended, maybe worse. They should be, Sam said firmly. If they've been complicit, they don't belong here. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, his expression hard to read. Not everyone sees it that way, Carter. You've made enemies. As Sam stepped out of Ramirez's office, the hostility in the air was palpable. Conversation stopped when she entered the room, and officers exchanged glances that were anything but friendly. Traitor, someone muttered as she passed. Sam ignored it, keeping her head high. But the weight of their disdain followed her everywhere. In the locker room, Harris approached her, his expression tense. You're not exactly winning any popularity contests, he said, leaning against the wall. That's not why I'm here, Sam replied, shoving her bag into her locker. Harris lowered his voice. You know they're blaming you for this, right? Daniels might be gone, But a lot of these guys think you sold out the precinct to IA. I didn't sell out anyone, Sam said sharply. I exposed corruption. If they have a problem with that, it says more about them than it does about me. Harris hesitated, then nodded. Just watch your back, Carter. Not everyone plays by the rules. The tension boiled over during a morning briefing. Ramirez stood at the front of the room, addressing the officers about the ongoing IA investigation. This is a difficult time for all of us, he said. But we have a responsibility to cooperate fully and ensure this department operates with integrity. Someone scoffed from the back of the room. Sam turned to see Officer Miller, one of Daniel's closest allies, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Integrity? Miller said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That's rich, coming from someone who let an outsider waltz in and tear us apart. The room tensed, all eyes shifting between Miller and Sam. You have something to say, Miller? Sam asked, her tone ice cold. Yeah, I do, he said, stepping forward. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Cleaning up the department, rooting out the bad apples. But all you've done is put a target on all of us. If you're worried about being exposed, Sam said evenly, maybe you should take a look at your own actions. Miller took another step closer, his face hardening. You don't belong here, Carter. You never did. Ramirez intervened before the situation escalated further. That's enough, Miller. Get back to work. Miller glared at Sam one last time before turning on his heel and leaving the room, slamming the door behind him. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. IA investigators moved through the precinct like a storm, uncovering more evidence of misconduct. Several officers were suspended pending further investigation, their desks cleared out under the watchful eyes of their colleagues. Sam found herself called into endless meetings, answering questions about her findings, her actions, and her role in exposing Daniels. You've stirred up a lot of trouble, Lieutenant, one IA investigator said during a particularly tense interview. I'm doing my job, Sam replied. The investigator leaned back in his chair, studying her. It's not just Daniels. The more we dig, the more we find. This department has been rotten for years. Then it's about time someone cleaned it up, Sam said without hesitation. By the end of the week, the precinct felt like a battlefield. Officers who had once ignored Sam now openly avoided her. Conversations became guarded. The camaraderie that once defined the team now fractured beyond repair. Sam sat at her desk, reviewing the latest batch of IA findings. The list of implicated officers had grown, and with it, the scope of the investigation. Harris approached her, dropping a folder onto her desk. More from IA, he said, his tone clipped. Thanks, Sam replied, flipping through the pages. He hesitated, then sat down across from her. Look, Carter, I don't agree with everything Daniels did, but this is bad. People are scared. They're losing their jobs, their reputations. Some of them don't deserve it. Sam looked up at him, her expression unyielding. And some of them do. This isn't about hurting people, Harris. It's about accountability. He nodded slowly, though the tension in his expression didn't fade. Late that night, Sam stayed behind after the precinct had emptied out. The quiet was unsettling. The usual hum of activity replaced by a heavy stillness. She pulled out her notes, piecing together the timeline of events that had led to Daniel's arrest and the subsequent fallout. The more she looked at it, the more she realized how deep the corruption ran. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. The message was short and chilling. You think this is over? It's not. Sam's grip tightened on the phone, but she refused to let the fear take hold. She knew this fight was far from over, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. The fallout from Daniel's arrest had revealed just how broken the system was. But it had also made one thing clear. The corruption extended far beyond a single officer. Sam's resolve hardened. She would see this through, no matter the cost. The fallout from the internal affairs investigation left the Eastbridge precinct in disarray. Officers shuffled through their shifts with a sense of unease, unsure of what might come next. The usual rhythm of the station had been replaced by a tense, awkward quiet. Sam stood at the head of the conference room, a stack of papers in her hands. Ramirez sat to her right, his arms crossed, watching the room as officers filtered in. Some avoided her gaze, others glared openly, but no one dared to speak as the meeting began. We're here to discuss the future of this department, Sam said, her tone sharp and unwavering. The IA investigation has made one thing clear. The old ways of operating are over. A murmur rippled through the room, but Sam continued before anyone could interrupt. Effective immediately, we're implementing a series of reforms to address the systemic issues that led to this mess, she said, placing a document on the table. These changes aren't optional, and they're not up for debate. Ramirez leaned forward, his voice steady. Lieutenant Carter has my full support in this. We need to rebuild trust, both within this department and with the community we serve. One officer, Miller, scoffed from the back of the room. You really think a few new rules are going to fix this place? Sam met his gaze, her voice cold. It's a start. And if you can't get on board, there's the door. Miller glared at her but said nothing further. Sam laid out the plan. Mandatory body cameras. Every officer will be equipped with a body camera, and tampering with the footage will result in immediate suspension, she stated. Ethics training. All personnel will undergo quarterly ethics training to reinforce accountability and proper conduct. Enhanced oversight. A new oversight committee will review all complaints and incidents of misconduct to ensure transparency. The room was silent, the weight of the changes sinking in. Ramirez broke the tension. This isn't about punishing anyone for the sake of it. It's about making sure this department is a place we can be proud of. An officer raised a hand hesitantly. Captain, what about resources? We're already stretched thin, Sam answered quickly. The funding will come from reallocating budgets previously wasted on redundant initiatives. If this precinct wants to function effectively, we need to prioritize integrity over convenience. After the meeting, Ramirez caught up with Sam in the hallway. You handled that well, he said, his tone softer than she was used to. They'll push back, Sam replied. They will, Ramirez agreed. But they'll come around. They have to. She turned to face him, studying his expression. I wasn't sure if you'd back me on this. Ramirez sighed, leaning against the wall. I wasn't sure either, but watching what's happened, seeing how deep the rot goes, I knew something had to change. You were right, Carter. This department can't survive if we keep doing things the way we always have. Sam nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It's a start. Not everyone embraced the changes. Within days, several officers requested transfers, unwilling to work under the new rules. Others, like Miller, openly resisted, finding ways to slow the implementation of reforms. One afternoon, Ramirez called Sam into his office. Miller's filed a grievance, he said, sliding a paper across the desk. Sam scanned the document, her jaw tightening. He's claiming the new policies are discriminatory, Ramirez nodded. Says they create an atmosphere of distrust. They're meant to, Sam said bluntly. Ramirez chuckled despite himself. I figured you'd say that. Don't worry, I'm handling it. He'll come around, or he won't. Either way, he's not stopping this. Amid the pushback, there were glimmers of progress. Younger officers like Harris began stepping up, openly supporting the reforms, and even volunteering to help train others. Never thought I'd say this, Harris admitted during one training session. But you've got my respect, Carter. This place needed a shakeup and you didn't back down. Let's just hope it sticks, Sam replied, her tone measured. It will, Harris said confidently. You've already done the hard part, making people care. By the end of the month, the changes were starting to take hold. The body cameras were in place. The first round of ethics training was complete, and the oversight committee had begun reviewing cases. Sam walked through the precinct, noting the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The hostility hadn't disappeared, but it was quieter now, replaced by a grudging acceptance of the new normal. Ramirez approached her near the evidence room, his expression thoughtful. You've done a lot in a short time, he said. There's still more to do, Sam replied. There always will be, Ramirez said. But this is a good start. Sam nodded. It's a foundation. Now we just have to keep building. The precinct had begun to settle into a new rhythm under the reforms, but Sam knew better than to believe the battle was over. Daniels had gone quiet since his arrest, yet the silence felt ominous. Then, late one evening, the storm finally broke. Sam was in her office when her phone buzzed with an urgent call from Harris. Carter, he said, his voice taut. It's Daniels. He's out on bail and something's happening. Sam's stomach tightened. What do you mean something's happening? He's not laying low, Harris replied. He's rallying his old crew. Guy's still loyal to him. I overheard talk about making a statement, and it doesn't sound good. Where? Sam asked sharply. They've been spotted at the old industrial park, Harris said. Captain Ramirez is already on his way. Sam didn't wait. Grabbing her jacket, she headed straight for the parking lot, calling Ramirez as she drove. The industrial park loomed dark and foreboding as Sam pulled up. Ramirez's car was parked nearby, but there was no sign of him or the backup he had promised. Captain, do you copy? Sam said into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Static crackled, followed by Ramirez's voice. We're inside. Warehouse 2. Daniels has hostages. Hostages. The word hit Sam like a punch. Daniels wasn't just making a statement. He was going all in. Sam approached the warehouse cautiously, her weapon drawn. The faint glow of a single light illuminated the space inside. She slipped through the door, scanning the room. Ramirez was crouched behind a stack of crates, motioning for her to join him. 4 of them, he whispered as she knelt beside him. Daniels and 3 others. They've got 2 civilians tied up near the back wall. Sam's jaw tightened. What's their plan? Not clear, Ramirez replied. But Daniels is making demands. He wants the charges dropped, immunity, and his badge reinstated. Sam's eyes narrowed. That's not happening. No, it's not, Ramirez agreed. But we need to get those hostages out of here before this escalates. Daniel's voice echoed through the warehouse, cold and confident. You think this changes anything, Ramirez? You think you can waltz in here and lecture me about rules? You're just like the rest of them. Weak, spineless. Sam stepped into view, her gun trained on him. Daniels, it's over. Drop the weapon and let the hostages go. He turned to face her, his smirk widening. Ah, Carter, always so righteous. How's that working out for you? Don't test me, Sam said, her voice steady. This is your last chance to stand down. Daniels chuckled, raising his hands mockingly, though his gun remained at his side. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about me. It's about the system you're so desperate to fix. It doesn't want to be fixed. And neither do the people who keep it running. Then you're as delusional as you are corrupt. Sam shot back. Daniel's smirk faltered for a moment, before he glanced at his crew. Let's show them how things work around here. One of Daniel's men raised his weapon, and chaos erupted. Sam dove behind a stack of crates as bullets tore through the air. Ramirez returned fire, keeping the attackers pinned down while Sam circled around the side, her movement swift and deliberate. Cover me! She shouted to Ramirez, who shifted his position to draw the gunman's attention. Sam moved toward the hostages, her eyes darting between Daniels and his men. One of the captives, a middle-aged man, was struggling against his restraints, his face pale with fear. I've got you, Sam whispered, as she cut through the ropes binding his hands. She gestured for him to stay low, then moved to the second hostage. A young woman, tears streaming down her face. As Sam freed her, Daniels's voice rang out. Don't even think about it, Carter! Sam turned to see him aiming his gun directly at her, his finger on the trigger. Drop it, Daniels, she said, her voice calm despite the danger. You first, he sneered. The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, from the corner of her eye, Sam saw Harris appear behind Daniels, his weapon raised. Daniels! Harris shouted. Daniels hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. It was all the distraction Sam needed. She lunged forward, knocking the gun from his hand and sending it skidding across the floor. They grappled briefly, but Sam's training gave her the upper hand. She pinned him to the ground as Harris secured the weapon. It's over, Daniels, Sam said, her voice cold as Ramirez moved in to cuff him. The aftermath was swift. The hostages were escorted out safely, and Daniels' men were taken into custody. As Daniels was led away, he glared at Sam one last time. You think you've won? He spat. This changes nothing. Sam didn't respond, watching as he disappeared into the back of a patrol car. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense, but focused. Ramirez called a meeting to debrief the team and ensure every detail of the operation was documented. When it was over, he pulled Sam aside. You handled yourself well tonight, he said. We did what we had to do, Sam replied. Ramirez nodded. And Daniels? He's done, Sam said firmly. But the work isn't. Corruption didn't die with one arrest. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for another chance to take root. And she was determined to stay vigilant, no matter how long it took. The precinct was quieter now. Daniels and his allies were gone. Internal Affairs had concluded its investigation, and the reforms Sam had fought for were beginning to take hold. Yet the silence wasn't peace. It was the calm after a storm, the kind that hinted at battles yet to come. Sam stood by the large glass window of the precinct's second floor, looking out over the city she had sworn to protect. The skyline was dotted with lights, a reminder of the lives being lived beyond the walls of Eastbridge. Her reflection stared back at her, tired, but resolute. Ramirez entered the room, his presence breaking the stillness. "You've done a lot," he said, his voice measured. "Most people would have walked away." "Walking away wasn't an option," Sam replied, turning to face him. He nodded, folding his arms. "Daniels is gone. The reforms are in place. But you know this isn't the end." "I do," Sam said. "The system doesn't fix itself overnight. There's still corruption hiding in the cracks, waiting for the right moment to resurface." "Then why keep fighting?" Ramirez asked, his tone genuine. Sam thought for a moment before answering. "Because someone has to. If we don't hold the line, the system will swallow us whole. This precinct, this city, it deserves better." Ramirez studied her, then gave a small nod of approval. "You've got guts, Carter. I'll give you that." Later that evening, Sam stood in front of the precinct building, the cool night air brushing against her face. The emblem of Eastbridge Police Department gleamed faintly under the streetlights. She thought of everything that had happened, the hostility from her colleagues, Daniels's threats, the danger she had faced in the warehouse. It all felt like a lifetime ago, yet the weight of it lingered. But there was also pride. She had stood her ground, refusing to bend in the face of corruption and complacency. The system was far from perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. A young officer passed her on the way out, offering a hesitant nod. Sam returned it, sensing the shift in his demeanor. The reforms weren't just rules. They were changing the culture, little by little. The next morning, Sam sat at her desk, reviewing a new batch of reports. The precinct was buzzing with activity, but the tension that had once defined it had started to fade. Officers moved with purpose, their interactions less guarded. Harris approached her desk, dropping off a file. "Got something for you," he said. "Thanks," Sam replied, flipping through the pages. He hesitated, then added, "No, not everyone will admit it, but what you did here, it mattered." Sam looked up, meeting his gaze. "That's the idea." Harris smirked. "Well, don't get too comfortable. There's always another mess waiting around the corner." Sam smiled faintly. "I'll be ready." As the day ended, Sam found herself back outside the precinct, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. She thought about the long road ahead, about the challenges, the resistance, and the victories yet to be won. She knew the fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that change was possible if she kept pushing. The question lingered in her mind, one she knew others might ask themselves. If you were in my position, would you fight? Would you stand up against a broken system, knowing the cost? The answer, for her, was clear. As the lights of the city began to flicker on, Sam turned back toward the precinct, her steps steady and her resolve unshaken. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Samantha Carter's story reminds us that the fight for justice is never easy. It's a battle fought not just against individuals, but against deeply ingrained systems that resist change. Her determination to hold the line, even when faced with overwhelming odds, challenges us to reflect on our own actions. If you were in Sam's position, would you have the courage to take a stand? What does accountability mean to you, and how far would you go to protect it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If this story inspired you or got you thinking about the importance of integrity and change, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can amplify stories that matter and spark conversations that lead to meaningful change. See you in the next one.
The sun was barely rising over the tree-lined streets of Oakwood Heights, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. It was the kind of place where white picket fences, manicured lawns, and luxury cars parked in spacious driveways painted a picture of perfection. For Officer James Cooper, it was also a place where people like Emily Carter didn't belong, or so he thought. Stationed at a routine checkpoint that morning, James adjusted his uniform as a black Tesla rolled up to his squad car. He squinted at the sleek vehicle, its pristine condition irritating him for reasons he didn't quite understand. When the driver lowered her tinted window, James was greeted by the calm, confident gaze of a black woman in her mid-30s, wearing a tailored blazer and subtle gold jewelry. She looked composed, professional, out of place. "Good morning, officer," she greeted, her tone polite but firm. James didn't return the pleasantries. Instead, he leaned slightly into the window, his eyes scanning her interior as if searching for something suspicious. "License and registration," he barked. Emily raised a brow but complied without hesitation. "Of course," she said, reaching for her glove compartment. She moved deliberately, careful to avoid any sudden motions. It wasn't the first time she had been in this position, and she knew how easily things could escalate. As James examined her documents, he took his time, flipping them over as if searching for some irregularity. "What brings you to this area?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. Emily hesitated, measuring her words. "I'm on my way to a meeting," she replied evenly. "A meeting," James repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. He gestured toward the neighborhood behind him. "In Oakwood Heights. A lot of crime happens when people are somewhere they shouldn't be. You don't look like you live around here." Emily blinked, keeping her composure. "Excuse me." "You heard me," James shot back, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as if to emphasize his authority. "What kind of meeting are you really going to? And whose car is this?" Emily inhaled sharply. She wasn't sure if it was anger or exhaustion that hit her harder in that moment, but she chose her words carefully. "This is my car. And the meeting I'm heading to is none of your business." "That was a mistake." James straightened, his jaw tightening. "None of my business," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Let me tell you something, ma'am. When I see someone driving a car like this, dressed like you, in a neighborhood like this, it is my business." Emily leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't aware that professionalism was a crime, officer." James stepped away from her car, circling it slowly like a predator. He peered into the windows, inspected the license plate, and even looked underneath as if expecting to find something incriminating. His actions drew the attention of a few joggers and dog walkers, who slowed their pace to watch. Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. The humiliation was palpable, and she could feel the eyes of strangers on her, judging her, pitying her. But she refused to give James the satisfaction of reacting. After what felt like an eternity, James returned to her window. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Her eyes widened. "On what grounds?" "I said, step out of the car," he repeated, his tone sharp. Emily stared at him for a moment before complying. She stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she stood tall, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. James gestured for her to stand by the front of her car, where he began patting her down. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. "That's not for you to decide," James retorted. As his hands searched her pockets and her belongings, Emily clenched her jaw, biting back every retort that burned on the tip of her tongue. She knew the power dynamics at play here. When James finally stepped back, he tossed her documents onto the hood of her car. "You're clean," he muttered, as if disappointed. Emily took a deep breath, picking up her papers and holding them tightly. She met James's gaze with a steady determination. "For your information, Officer Cooper," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I'm on my way to a meeting at the Central Precinct. And if you must know, it's with the Internal Affairs Division." James stiffened. "Internal Affairs?" "That's right," she confirmed, brushing invisible dust off her blazer. "I'm Emily Carter, the new head of the unit. I'm late for my first day, thanks to you." For the first time that morning, James was silent. His eyes darted to her car, her papers, her face, as if piecing together a puzzle he wished he hadn't started. Emily stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You see, Officer Cooper, I've spent my entire career fighting to hold people like you accountable. I know exactly what you were doing just now, and I know exactly why you did it. But don't worry," she said, a faint, bitter smile crossing her lips. You'll be seeing more of me soon." With that, she slid back into her car and drove off, leaving James standing in the middle of the street, his face pale and his heart pounding. He returned to his squad car in a daze, barely registering the voice of his partner, Officer Ryan, who had been watching from a distance. "Hey, you okay?" "Who was that?" Ryan asked, leaning over to peer at James's face. James didn't answer immediately. He was too busy logging into the system, searching for her name. When her profile popped up on the screen, her title stared back at him like a slap in the face. Emily Carter, Head of Internal Affairs. Ryan whistled low. "Well, shit," he muttered. "You just picked the wrong woman to mess with." James swallowed hard, his mind racing. He replayed every word he had said, every action he had taken. The way he had humiliated her, the way he had assumed the worst about her. It was all coming back to haunt him. "She's going to bury me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ryan raised an eyebrow. "You think?" James leaned back in his seat, staring blankly out the windshield as the weight of what he'd done began to settle on his shoulders. For the first time in years, the veteran officer felt something he wasn't used to: fear. And for the first time, he wondered if he truly deserved what was coming next. The next morning, James couldn't escape the tightening knot in his stomach. The station was unusually lively, with officers gathered in clusters, talking in hushed tones. Whispers about a new internal affairs head spread like wildfire. No one knew much about Emily Carter yet, but rumors were already flying. "Apparently, she's tough as nails," one officer said to another by the coffee machine. "Heard she doesn't tolerate any bullshit," added another, shaking his head. James stood frozen at his desk, his ears burning as snippets of conversation reached him. Each word felt like a nail being hammered into a coffin with his name on it. His mind replayed the encounter from the day before, her calm yet cutting words, the subtle disdain in her eyes. He had been caught completely off guard, and now the fallout was inevitable. "Hey, Cooper!" James jolted at the sound of his name. Officer Ryan appeared beside him, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Still thinking about yesterday?" James didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared blankly at his computer screen, where he had been pretending to review reports. Ryan took a sip of coffee and leaned closer. "Look, man, maybe it won't be so bad. She doesn't seem like the vindictive type. Just apologize, play it cool. She might cut you some slack." James let out a bitter laugh. "Cut me some slack? Ryan, I humiliated her. In front of half the neighborhood, no less. And now she's my boss. You think she's just going to forget about that?" Ryan shrugged. "I mean, technically, she can't target you just because of that. She has to follow procedure." "Procedure?" James muttered, shaking his head. "You think I don't know how this works? I've seen internal affairs ruin careers for less than what I did. They don't play fair." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when a sudden hush fell over the room. All eyes turned toward the entrance as Emily Carter stepped into the precinct for the first time. She was a commanding presence, her sharp navy blazer and confident stride radiating authority. A leather folder rested under her arm, and her expression was calm, composed, unreadable. The chatter died down completely as officers straightened their postures, some even adjusting their uniforms. James felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to disappear, to blend into the background, but it was too late. Emily's sharp gaze scanned the room, taking in every face, and when her eyes landed on him, she paused for a split second. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but James felt it, a flicker of recognition, a moment of silent acknowledgement. Then, just as quickly, she looked away and addressed the room. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady but firm. "My name is Emily Carter, and as you've probably heard, I'm the new head of Internal Affairs. I won't take up too much of your time today, but I wanted to introduce myself and set a few expectations." The officers exchanged nervous glances as she continued. "My job," Emily said, pacing slowly, "is to ensure that this department operates with integrity, accountability, and fairness. I'm not here to make friends, and I'm not here to pick fights. I'm here to do what's right, for the department, for the community, and for the badge." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. No one dared to interrupt. "I know there's a lot of tension between internal affairs and the rest of the force," she admitted, stopping in the center of the room. "And I know some of you may see me as the enemy. But let me be clear, I don't want to be your enemy. I want to work with you, not against you. However," her gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on James again before moving on. "If you step out of line, if you abuse your power, if you think you're above the law, you'll find out very quickly that I'm not someone to mess with." James's palms began to sweat. Her words weren't directed at him specifically, but he felt every syllable like a dagger to the chest. "Any questions?" Emily asked, raising an eyebrow. Silence. No one dared to speak. "Good," she said, her tone lightening slightly. "I look forward to working with all of you. My office is upstairs if you need to reach me." With that, she turned and walked toward the stairs, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. As soon as she was out of sight, the room erupted into whispered conversations. James slumped back in his chair, his heart pounding. He knew it was only a matter of time before she called him in. And sure enough, not 10 minutes later, an email notification popped up on his screen. Subject: Meeting request. From Emily Carter. To James Cooper. Time: 3 p.m. Location: Internal Affairs Office. James stared at the message, his stomach sinking. Ryan leaned over his shoulder, whistling softly when he saw the email. 3 o'clock, huh? Ryan said. Guess she didn't waste any time. James groaned, running a hand through his hair. What the hell am I supposed to say to her? Ryan shrugged. Be honest. Own up to it. You screwed up, man, but maybe she'll respect you more if you admit it. James wasn't so sure. At 3 o'clock sharp, James knocked on the door to Emily's office. Come in, came her voice from the other side. He stepped inside, his pulse racing. Emily was seated behind a sleek wooden desk, her leather folder open in front of her. She didn't look up right away, instead finishing a note she was writing. Officer Cooper, she said finally, gesturing for him to sit. He obeyed, his mouth dry. Emily leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, she simply studied him, her expression unreadable. James squirmed under her gaze, resisting the urge to speak first. Do you know why you're here? She asked finally. Yes, ma'am, James said, his voice tight. Emily raised an eyebrow. Do you? James hesitated. It's about yesterday. At the checkpoint. Correct, Emily said. She opened her folder and slid a piece of paper across the desk toward him. This is your incident report. I want you to read it out loud. James's stomach twisted. Out loud? Yes, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He picked up the report, his hands trembling slightly, and began to read. Stopped a black female driver in Oakwood Heights. Vehicle was a Tesla Model S. Driver appeared out of place. He trailed off, unable to continue. Go on, Emily prompted. James swallowed hard and kept reading. The words felt like poison in his mouth. Every assumption, every baseless accusation, every word dripping with bias. When he finished, he looked up at her, his face flushed with shame. Emily leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. Do you know what this reads like, Officer Cooper? James shook his head, unable to speak. It reads like prejudice, she said bluntly. It reads like someone who judges people based on their appearance rather than their actions. Do you understand the implications of that? Yes, ma'am, he whispered. Emily stared at him for a long moment before nodding. Good. Because this isn't just about me, Officer Cooper. It's about every person you've ever stopped, every life you've affected, every decision you've made while wearing that badge. James felt the weight of her words settle over him like a storm cloud. This isn't over, Emily said, closing her folder. You'll hear from me soon. And just like that, the meeting was over. James sat in the break room of the precinct, staring blankly at the untouched sandwich in front of him. The usually bustling space felt suffocating, the voices of his colleagues reduced to a dull hum in the background. His mind was elsewhere, on Emily Carter, the meeting, and the storm brewing around him. The precinct was alive with speculation about her. Officers treaded carefully, their usual camaraderie replaced by whispered conversations behind closed doors. James couldn't escape the feeling that every glance thrown his way carried a hint of judgment, a silent acknowledgement of his mistakes. "Hey, Cooper," Ryan's voice broke through the fog. He slid into the chair across from him, his tone lower than usual. "You look like hell." James didn't respond. He picked at the corner of the sandwich wrapper, avoiding Ryan's gaze. "Look, I get it," Ryan said, leaning forward. "She's coming down hard, but maybe this is your chance to—" "To what?" James snapped, finally looking up. "Redeem myself? Convince her I'm not a racist asshole? What am I supposed to do, Ryan? Rewrite the past?" Ryan sighed. "You screwed up. We've all screwed up. But sitting here wallowing in self-pity isn't going to help. You're going to have to face her again, and when you do, you'd better figure out how to own up to it." James opened his mouth to argue but stopped when the door swung open. Officer Alvarez stepped inside, holding a clipboard. "Cooper," she called out, her tone curt. "You're needed upstairs." "No." James felt his stomach drop. Ryan gave him a sympathetic look, but James ignored it. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs heavier than usual, and followed Alvarez out the door. Emily's office felt colder today, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare over the spotless desk and the neatly organized folders. James stood stiffly in front of her, his hands clasped behind his back like a cadet awaiting discipline. Emily was reading through a report, her pen moving steadily as she made notes in the margins. She didn't acknowledge James's presence right away, forcing him to stand there in silence, his anxiety mounting with each passing second. Finally, she set the report down and looked up at him. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes carried a sharpness that made James feel like she could see straight through him. "Officer Cooper," she began, folding her hands on the desk. "I assume you're aware of why you're here." "Yes, ma'am," James replied, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at his insides. Emily tilted her head slightly. "Are you?" James hesitated. "Because of my conduct during the traffic stop," he said, carefully choosing his words. Emily nodded slowly. "That's part of it," she said. "But it's not just about the traffic stop, Officer Cooper. It's about a pattern of behavior, a pattern that's reflected in your record." James felt a prickle of dread crawl up his spine. "My record?" Emily opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. "I've reviewed your history. Do you know how many complaints of racial bias have been filed against you in the past 5 years? James's throat went dry. He glanced at the document but couldn't bring himself to read it. 7, Emily said, answering the question for him. 7 complaints. Do you know how many of them were formally investigated? James shook his head, his voice failing him. 2, Emily continued. The others were dismissed for lack of evidence. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. But do you know what I see when I look at this? I see a pattern of prejudice, of profiling, of abusing your authority. And yesterday, you added another incident to that list. James's fists clenched at his sides. With all due respect, ma'am, I've always done my job by the book. Emily raised an eyebrow. By the book? Is that what you call stopping a black woman in a luxury car, searching her without cause, and humiliating her in public? Is that what you call good policing? James opened his mouth to respond but faltered. He had no defense. Emily leaned back in her chair, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. Do you know why I joined Internal Affairs, Officer Cooper? James shook his head, unsure where she was going with this. I have a younger brother, she said, her tone softening slightly. His name is Marcus. Smart kid, big heart, always wanted to make a difference in the world. A faint smile crossed her lips before fading. A few years ago, Marcus was arrested. He was accused of stealing a car he was driving because he worked for the owner as a valet. James's stomach churned. He tried to explain, but the officers wouldn't listen. They saw a young black man behind the wheel of a Mercedes, and that was all they needed to assume he was a criminal. He spent 2 nights in jail before the truth came out. By then, the damage was done. Emily's voice grew colder as she continued. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch someone you love be treated like a suspect just because of the color of their skin? To see them lose faith in a system that's supposed to protect them? James couldn't meet her eyes. That's why I'm here, Officer Cooper, Emily said. To make sure that what happened to Marcus doesn't happen to anyone else. To hold officers like you accountable when they cross the line. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he wasn't the monster she was making him out to be. But deep down, he knew she was right. He began, his voice faltering. I didn't mean. Intention doesn't matter, Emily interrupted sharply. Impact does. Your actions have consequences, Officer Cooper. Not just for the people you target, but for the entire community. Every time you abuse your authority, you make it harder for the public to trust us. You make it harder for good officers to do their jobs. James swallowed hard, his chest tight with guilt. Emily studied him for a moment before sighing. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately, she said. During that time, you'll be required to attend mandatory training on racial bias and ethics in policing. And when you return, your performance will be closely monitored. Do you understand? James nodded numbly. Yes, ma'am. Emily closed the folder and set it aside. You're dismissed. James turned to leave but paused at the door. Chief Carter, he said quietly, glancing back at her. I'm sorry. For everything. Emily didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. Don't apologize to me, Officer Cooper. Apologize to the people you've wronged. And then do better. James nodded and left the office, the weight of her words following him out the door. James hadn't felt this out of place in years. He sat stiffly in a small windowless room on the second floor of the city's police academy, surrounded by a half-dozen other officers. The chairs were uncomfortable, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the air carried the stale scent of old coffee. The trainer, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and a badge identifying him as a consultant from a national policing reform organization, stood at the front of the room. He held a marker in his hand, writing the words "implicit bias" in large letters on a whiteboard. James's jaw tightened as he read the words. This was day one of his mandatory training, a series of sessions focused on ethics, bias, and community policing. It was the first step in what Emily Carter had called his path to accountability. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He felt like he didn't belong here, like the others were staring at him, judging him. The truth was, he had barely slept since his meeting with Emily. Her words haunted him, cutting deeper than he expected. He thought about her brother, Marcus, and the pain in her voice when she described what had happened to him. For the first time in a long time, James felt something he couldn't quite name. Shame, maybe. All right, the trainer said, his voice calm but firm. Let's start with a simple question. What comes to mind when you hear the word bias? Silence filled the room. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, none of them wanting to speak first. James crossed his arms over his chest, staring down at the table in front of him. Finally, a younger officer spoke up. I guess it's when you judge someone unfairly? That's a good start, the trainer replied, nodding. He wrote the word judgment under implicit bias on the whiteboard. Bias is about how we see the world, how we interpret people and situations. It's not always conscious, but it influences our decisions in ways we don't realize. He turned to face the group, his gaze steady. Now, let's get uncomfortable. Who here has made an assumption about someone based on their appearance, their race, or where they're from? The question hung in the air like a challenge. No one moved. James felt his chest tighten. His instinct was to look away, to deny, to defend himself. But the memory of Emily's face, her calm yet cutting words, stopped him. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his hand. The trainer nodded approvingly. Thank you for your honesty, Officer Cooper. A few others raised their hands after him, though most kept their arms firmly at their sides. Now, the trainer continued, think about the impact of those assumptions. How did they affect the person you were dealing with? How did they affect your ability to do your job fairly and effectively? James's mind raced. He thought about all the times he had stopped someone because they didn't look like they belonged. The young man he pulled over for driving an old car in a wealthy neighborhood. The woman he frisked outside a convenience store because she looked nervous. And, of course, Emily Carter. He swallowed hard, the weight of those moments pressing down on him. He had always justified his actions as just doing the job, but now he wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, James found himself forced to confront truths he had spent years avoiding. The training sessions were grueling, not because of the content itself, but because of what they forced him to acknowledge about himself. One exercise hit particularly hard. The trainer handed out a series of photos, people of different races, ages, and appearances, and asked the officers to write down their first impressions. James stared at the photo in front of him, a black teenager in a hoodie, headphones around his neck, his hands shoved in his pockets. His first thought came immediately, unbidden, trouble. He frowned, ashamed of how automatic the judgment was. When the trainer asked the group to share their answers, James hesitated. But when his turn came, he forced himself to be honest. "I wrote trouble," he admitted, his voice low. The trainer nodded, not judgmental but thoughtful. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Cooper. Now let me ask you this. What in that photo tells you this person is trouble?" James stared at the image, his mind blank. I don't know," he admitted. "Exactly," the trainer said. "That assumption doesn't come from the photo. It comes from you. From the stereotypes and biases you've internalized over the years. That's what we're here to work on." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He realized, maybe for the first time, just how deeply those biases ran, and how they had shaped his actions as a police officer. Outside of the training sessions, James's leave gave him plenty of time to think and to reflect on his career. For years, he had prided himself on being a tough but fair cop, someone who got the job done no matter what. But now, he wasn't so sure. One evening, as he sat alone in his small apartment, he opened his laptop and began typing. The words came slowly at first, halting and uncertain, but soon they poured out of him like a confession. "Dear Chief Carter, I don't know if you'll read this, but I need to say it anyway. I owe you an apology, not just for the way I treated you, but for everything that moment represents. For years, I told myself that I was just doing my job, that my actions were about keeping the city safe. But the truth is, I let my biases guide me. I judged people without even realizing it, and I justified it as good policing. I see now how wrong I was. You were right. My actions have consequences. Not just for the people I've hurt, but for the trust between the police and the community. I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. The training has been eye-opening, to say the least. It's forced me to confront parts of myself that I didn't want to see. But I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful to you for holding me accountable, even when it would have been easier to write me off as a lost cause. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better, not just for myself, but for the people I serve. Thank you for giving me the chance to change. Sincerely, James Cooper." James stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. He didn't know if Emily would respond, or if she even cared. But for the first time, he felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. James stood in front of the community center, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. The building buzzed with activity. Families arriving for workshops, children laughing as they chased each other across the courtyard, volunteers unpacking crates of food for distribution. It wasn't a place James ever imagined himself visiting, let alone entering. But here he was, 6 weeks into his mandatory leave, attending yet another bias training session. He had attended every session so far, each one more uncomfortable than the last. The trainers didn't pull punches. They spoke openly about systemic racism, implicit bias, and the devastating impact of police misconduct on communities of color. James had never been forced to confront his beliefs and behaviors so directly, and it was like staring into a mirror he barely recognized. As he stepped inside, James scanned the room, spotting familiar faces among the officers in attendance. Most of them sat with their arms crossed, their expressions guarded. James understood the resistance. He'd felt it too in the beginning. But something had shifted in him over the past few weeks. The first time James had to sit down and listen to community members share their stories, he'd felt defensive, like every word was a personal attack. But as the days went on, those stories began to sink in. A teenage boy falsely accused of shoplifting because he fit the description. A mother who taught her son to keep his hands visible and his voice low if he was ever stopped by the police. A man who spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. These were the people James had spent years dismissing as the problem. Now, he couldn't stop hearing their voices, couldn't stop seeing their faces. 2 weeks later, James returned to work. His reinstatement was conditional, his record would be monitored, and any misstep could result in immediate termination. But what weighed on him more than the scrutiny of his supervisors was the change in how his colleagues looked at him. Ryan, his closest friend on the force, seemed unsure of how to approach him. Other officers treated him with a mixture of pity and wariness, as if he were a ticking time bomb. And then there were those who openly resented him, muttering under their breath about caving to the woke agenda whenever he walked by. James didn't argue with them. He didn't have the energy. Instead, he focused on the work, real work. He started volunteering for community outreach programs, something he never would have considered before. He sat down with local leaders, listening to their concerns and asking what the department could do better. He even joined a mentorship program for at-risk youth, spending his weekends coaching basketball and helping kids with their homework. At first, his involvement was met with skepticism. Parents, teachers, and even some of the kids didn't trust him. But over time, as they saw him show up consistently, without a badge, without an agenda, some of those walls began to come down. It was during one of these community events that James saw Emily again. She arrived unannounced, dressed in casual slacks and a simple blouse, blending in with the crowd. James was helping a group of kids organize a book drive when he spotted her standing near the entrance, talking to one of the event coordinators. For a moment, he froze. He hadn't spoken to Emily since their last meeting in her office. He'd thought about writing to her, maybe requesting another conversation, but every time he picked up the pen, he hesitated. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow? Emily noticed him before he could slip away. She made her way over, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Officer Cooper," she greeted, her tone professional. "Chief Carter," he replied, straightening his posture. She glanced at the group of kids behind him, who were busy stacking books into neat piles. "Looks like you've been keeping busy." "Yes, ma'am," James said, clearing his throat. "It's part of the mentorship program. We help organize events like this on weekends." Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "It's good work. Necessary work." James shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say next. Finally, he decided to address the weight that had been pressing on him for weeks. "Chief Carter," he began, his voice hesitant. I've been meaning to thank you. For everything. For holding me accountable. For giving me a chance to change." Emily looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "Change doesn't come easy, Officer Cooper. It takes effort, humility, and a willingness to listen. You've taken the first steps, but the work doesn't end here." "I know," James said quickly. "And I'm not trying to act like I've suddenly fixed everything. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better." Emily studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded. "Good. Because this isn't just about you, Officer Cooper. It's about the community you serve, the people who look to you for protection. They deserve better, and so do the good officers who take their oath seriously." James nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. As Emily turned to leave, he called out to her. "Chief Carter." She paused, looking back at him. "I just want to say, I'm sorry. For what I did. For how I treated you. I know I can't undo it, but I want you to know that I regret it." Emily's gaze softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Regret is a start, Officer Cooper. But action is what makes the difference. Keep doing the work, and maybe one day, we won't need conversations like this anymore." James watched as she walked away, her words lingering in his mind. Months later, James stood at the edge of a packed auditorium, watching as Emily took the stage to speak at a community policing forum. She was poised, confident, and passionate as she addressed the crowd, her words carrying a sense of hope that felt infectious. James listened intently, her speech reminding him of how much his perspective had shifted. He still had a long way to go, but he no longer saw the world in the black and white terms that had defined his earlier years on the force. As the event ended, James left quietly, unnoticed by the crowd. He didn't need recognition for his progress, nor was he looking for it. What mattered to him now was the work, the slow, difficult, but necessary work of rebuilding trust, one step at a time. Emily's words echoed in his mind as he walked to his car. Keep doing the work. And for the first time in years, James believed he was finally on the right path.